Hansel and Gretel, the adult storybook edition. A fresh take on the classic fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Written by Raymond Davey. Spoken by Christine Fletcher. This adult version of the classic fairy tale follows the original storyline, but is set in a gritty, post-apocalyptic wasteland, where two siblings are abandoned and must fight for survival. Instead of a witch, they encounter a manipulative figure offering food and shelter, but at a deadly price. It's a tale of desperation, betrayal, and survival, where innocence is lost and the line between predator and prey blurs. Before we dive in, I'd love for you to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss out on any new stories, whether they're reimagined fairy tales, classic plays, or timeless legends, and it helps support more content like this. Now sit back, relax, and join me as we begin our journey into a gritty, post-apocalyptic world where survival comes at a deadly price. Welcome to Hansel and Gretel. Chapter 1. The Hunger. The wind swept across the barren landscape, howling through the skeletal remains of buildings, rattling the cracked, dry earth. A haze of dust hung in the air, blurring the horizon where the sun sank low, casting a sickly orange glow. There was no warmth in its light, only a reminder of what had once been before the collapse. Hansel crouched by the edge of the camp, sharpening a crude knife with a stone. His hands were steady despite the gnawing ache in his stomach. He kept his eyes on the task, not daring to look at Gretel, who sat a few feet away, silent and pale. She was always quiet now, her gaze distant, as if she were already somewhere else. Their camp was nothing more than a collection of makeshift tents, patched together with scraps of tarp and cloth. It was a pitiful sight, but it had been home for as long as Hansel could remember. Beyond the camp, the land stretched out like a wasteland, miles of cracked earth and dead trees, with no sign of life. Nothing grew here anymore, and what little food remained was running out fast. Their father's voice cut through the wind, low and rough. "We'll make do. We have to." Hansel didn't need to look to know who he was talking to. The stepmother. She'd been whispering her poison for weeks now, her voice sharp and cold. She spoke of survival, of making the hard choices that came with it. We won't survive like this," she snapped, her voice rising. "You know it. Look at them. They're too weak. They're just mouths to feed, and we don't have enough for all of us." Hansel tensed, his grip tightening on the knife. His gaze flickered toward Gretel. She didn't look back, but he could tell she was listening, just like he was. They'd heard it all before, the arguments, the accusations. The way she looked at them, with contempt and something darker, something that made Hansel's skin crawl. Their father was silent for a long moment, the weight of his hesitation hanging in the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired, broken. "I can't." "You can. You have to." Another pause, then the sound of footsteps moving away back toward the fire. The conversation was over, for now, but the stepmother wasn't finished. She would press again and again until their father gave in. Hansel could see it in the way her eyes narrowed, like a predator stalking its prey. He stood, slipping the knife into his belt, and crossed the few steps to where Gretel sat. She looked up at him, her dark hair falling in limp strands around her pale face. "We need to go," Hansel whispered, keeping his voice low. He didn't want the others to hear. Not yet. Gretel didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on the ground. She was always like this when it came to their father, as if she couldn't accept the truth that had already become clear to Hansel. Finally she spoke, her voice flat and resigned. "He won't stop her." Hansel shook his head. "No, he won't." There was no point in waiting for a miracle that wouldn't come. The world didn't work that way anymore. If they stayed, they'd be cast out, abandoned like all the others. Hansel had seen the way their stepmother looked at them, the way her lips twisted in disgust whenever she handed them a scrap of food. She wouldn't hesitate when the time came. "We leave tonight," he said, his voice firmer now, before they make the decision for us. Gretel finally met his gaze, her eyes hardening. She nodded. There was no need for more words. They both understood what was at stake. As the last light faded, casting long shadows over the camp, Hansel and Gretel made their preparations in silence. There wasn't much to take, just a few tattered blankets, a canteen half filled with water, and the knife Hansel had sharpened to a fine edge. He tucked a few bits of broken tech into his pocket, things he'd scavenged over the months, not because they were useful, but because they reminded him of the world that once was. The fire in the center of the camp flickered, casting eerie shapes on the surrounding tents. Their father sat by the flames, staring into them with a hollow expression, as if he were already somewhere far away. The stepmother was beside him, her sharp eyes darting in their direction every now and then. She knew they'd overheard, but she didn't care. She was waiting, biding her time. Hansel felt a pang of guilt as he watched his father, but it was fleeting. There was no room for guilt anymore. They had to survive. As night fell and the camp grew quiet, Hansel nudged Gretel, signaling it was time. They slipped into the darkness, moving quickly but quietly, keeping to the shadows. Every step felt like a betrayal, but Hansel pushed the thought aside. Survival came first. It had to. They moved away from the camp, leaving the firelight behind. The wasteland stretched before them, endless and bleak, but it was better than what lay behind. They didn't look back. Chapter 2: Into the Wasteland. The trees stood like brittle skeletons, their twisted limbs reaching toward a sky permanently stained gray. Nothing moved in the dead forest, not even the wind. Each step Hansel and Gretel took felt like a disturbance in a place that had long forgotten the sound of life. The soil beneath their feet was dry and cracked, its surface a patchwork of ash and dust. Every breath they drew tasted faintly of decay, as if the very air were suffocating under the weight of all that had been lost. Hansel walked ahead, his pace steady but cautious. The knife he'd sharpened was clutched tightly in one hand, while the other carefully dropped small bits of tech, broken circuit boards, shattered pieces of plastic, wires frayed beyond repair. Each one fell silently into the dust, marking their path like a trail of breadcrumbs. If they ever had to turn back, these remnants might be the only way to find their way through the vast nothingness that stretched endlessly behind them. Gretel followed a few paces behind, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if she could hold in the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. She didn't speak, her eyes fixed on the ground, her face a mask of weariness and suspicion. The forest had once been alive. Hansel could imagine it from stories their father had told them when they were younger. Tall trees that reached the heavens, their leaves thick and green, teeming with animals and birds that filled the air with sound. But now it was nothing more than a graveyard. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint crunch of their footsteps on dead leaves and brittle branches. Hansel slowed as they reached the edge of a clearing, his eyes scanning the desolation ahead. The ground here was more barren than ever, stripped of even the smallest hint of vegetation. Rocks jutted out like jagged teeth from the earth, and the remains of rusted cars sat abandoned, half sunk into the dirt. A distant memory of a world that had died long before they were born. Gretel stopped beside him, her gaze sharp, as if she were expecting something to leap out from the shadows. "How much longer do you think we can last out here?" she asked, her voice a harsh whisper. Hansel didn't answer right away. He didn't want to admit that he didn't know. He glanced at the canteen hanging from his belt, half empty now, the water inside barely enough to keep them going for another day or two. He swallowed, trying to keep his voice even. "We'll find something. We always do." Gretel gave a hollow laugh. "You still believe that?" He turned to face her, forcing a small smile. What else is there to believe? For a moment, their eyes locked. Hansel could see the exhaustion in her gaze, the weariness that had been growing since the moment they left the camp. But beneath it, there was something else, fear, not just of the wasteland around them, but of what lay ahead. "We'll be fine," he said quietly, though the words felt empty. They kept moving. Hours passed, the sun hanging low on the horizon, its light dim and sickly. The ache in Hansel's stomach gnawed at him, a constant reminder of how long it had been since they'd eaten anything substantial. The last bit of food they had, a withered root Hansel had dug up near a dead riverbed, had done little to ease the hunger. He kept his eyes on the barren landscape, hoping for something, anything, that might offer shelter or sustenance. But the wasteland had nothing to give. As the light began to fade, they stopped at the base of a fallen tree, its massive trunk split and decaying. Hansel crouched, reaching into his pack for the last bit of water. He took a small sip, then passed the canteen to Gretel. She hesitated before drinking, her eyes narrowing as she looked around. "We can't keep going like this." Hansel didn't argue. He knew she was right. Their strength was fading, and they couldn't afford to wander aimlessly for much longer. But what choice did they have? Turning back meant returning to nothing, to a camp that no longer wanted them. Gretel handed the canteen back and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "We need to find shelter. Soon." Hansel stood scanning the horizon again. The sun had almost disappeared, and soon the cold would come, biting and sharp, more merciless than any hunger. They couldn't stay here. He was about to speak when something flickered in the distance. A light. Barely visible through the dying trees, it glowed faintly against the gloom like a beacon cutting through the suffocating dark. Hansel's heart leapt in his chest. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice urgent. Gretel's eyes narrowed as she followed his gaze. "Could be a trap," she muttered. Her voice held no excitement, only suspicion. She had seen too much to trust in anything that appeared too good to be true. "Maybe, but it's the first sign of life we've seen for miles." She didn't argue. The choice was clear. Keep wandering through the wasteland with no food or water, or take the risk. Either way, the danger was real. But that light, it was a promise of something. Hansel tightened his grip on the knife and motioned for Gretel to follow. They moved cautiously, every step deliberate, as they approached the distant glow. The closer they got, the more the outline of a structure came into view. An old building, fortified and imposing, its windows shattered but barred. The walls were thick with metal reinforcements, and a faint flicker of light pulsed from within. Hansel stopped, crouching behind a rock, his heart pounding in his ears. The compound looked intact, almost untouched by the collapse. There was no movement, no sign of life, but the light was unmistakable. Gretel knelt beside him, her face pale in the fading twilight. "We can't just walk in there," she whispered, her voice edged with fear. Hansel swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know what they would find beyond those walls, but he knew one thing. They couldn't stay out here. "Let's check it out. Just carefully," he said. Gretel didn't respond, but the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. They both knew it wasn't safe, but at this point, nothing was. As they crept closer to the compound, the light flickered again, almost as if it were beckoning them in. Chapter 3: The Lure. The compound loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of steel and concrete. Its walls, reinforced with metal plates and barbed wire, stood tall against the desolate wasteland, a fortress in a land where everything else had crumbled. Faded advertisements, relics from the time before the collapse, clung to the sides of the building, smiling faces promoting long-dead products, their once bright colors now bleached by the sun. A broken neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie green light over the entrance, its meaning lost in a world where electricity was a rarity. Hansel and Gretel approached cautiously. sticking close to the shadows. The light from the windows, some kind of generator still working, was a beacon, pulling them closer, despite the warnings that echoed in Gretel's mind. She could feel the tension in the air, the sense that this place wasn't quite right. But there was no denying the allure. In a world where survival was a daily battle, the promise of food and shelter was a temptation impossible to resist. Hansel moved ahead, his eyes scanning the perimeter for signs of danger. He gestured for Gretel to follow, and together they crept toward the entrance, the knife clutched tightly in Hansel's hand. His grip on it was firm, but Gretel could sense his growing hope, the way he was letting himself believe, just for a moment, that they might have found something good. The heavy steel door creaked open, startling them both. Light spilled out, warm and inviting. For a heartbeat they froze, but then a voice called from within, soft and welcoming. "Who's out there? Come inside. Don't be shy." Hansel exchanged a glance with Gretel, his eyes wide with surprise. Before either of them could speak, the figure of a woman appeared in the doorway. She was older, her hair silver and neatly tied back, her face lined but not harsh. She wore clean, well-kept clothes, luxuries Hansel and Gretel hadn't seen in years. A soft smile played on her lips as she looked at them, her gaze sweeping over their ragged appearance with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "You must be starving," she said, her voice rich and soothing. "Come in, both of you. It's not safe to be out here." Hansel stepped forward, lowering the knife slightly. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "Just someone who knows what it's like to be hungry and cold. I've survived here for years, ever since things changed. But I have food, water, and shelter. You're welcome to it." Gretel's instincts flared, a prickling at the back of her neck. The woman's kindness felt practiced, too smooth, as if she'd used these same words 100 times before. Her eyes, though warm, seemed to watch them too closely, measuring them. Hansel, however, was already stepping closer. "You live here? Alone?" "For now, yes," she replied. "I was a scientist before, you see, when everything fell apart. I stayed hidden, kept myself alive. I knew how to prepare. There are supplies in this building, enough to last a lifetime if managed carefully." She stepped aside, beckoning them into the warmth beyond the doorway. The smell hit them first, something cooking. It wasn't much, just a faint scent, but after days of hunger it was enough to make Hansel's stomach growl loudly. Come in," she urged. "You'll be safe here, I promise." Hansel glanced back at Gretel, his face lit with cautious optimism. She hesitated, still uneasy, but the hunger gnawing at her insides made the decision for her. Reluctantly, she followed her brother inside. The interior of the compound was a stark contrast to the wasteland outside. The floors were clean, the walls lined with shelves of supplies, canned goods, bottles of water, neatly organized tools, and, most importantly, food. A small stove in the corner emitted the gentle crackle of a fire, a pot simmering on top. There were blankets folded in neat stacks, enough to keep them warm through the harshest nights. It was almost too good to be true. The woman closed the door behind them, the heavy thud of the lock sliding into place echoing through the room. She smiled again, moving toward the stove. "Sit, please, you both look exhausted." Hansel sank gratefully onto a chair, his eyes fixed on the pot as the woman ladled out a thin broth into bowls. Gretel stayed standing, her back pressed against the wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The compound felt too perfect. In a world where everything had fallen apart, this place seemed untouched. "Why are you helping us?" Gretel asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The woman didn't seem offended. She handed Hansel a bowl of broth and turned to Gretel with that same patient smile. "I've seen what happens to those who wander too long. It's not a kindness to let you go back out there, and besides, as she sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap, I've been alone here for a long time. It's nice to have company. Hansel, already halfway through his bowl of soup, looked up at Gretel. We're safe here, Gretel. We can rest. Gretel's eyes flicked back to the woman, searching for cracks in her mask. And what do you want from us in return? The woman's smile never faltered. Nothing much, just your trust. You'll find it's a precious thing these days, Dad. I've seen too many lose themselves to fear. But if you can trust me, I can help you. I have more food, more water, enough for you both to stay here, as long as you follow the rules and help out where you can. Hansel nodded, relief washing over his face. Gretel, however, felt her stomach tighten. Something about the way the woman spoke, the calmness, the certainty, set her on edge. Trust didn't come easily in the wasteland, and it certainly wasn't something to be given freely. But Hansel had already made up his mind. We'll stay, he said, his voice resolute. Gretel opened her mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She could see the exhaustion in Hansel's face, the way his shoulders sagged in relief. He wanted to believe they had finally found a place to rest. The woman stood, her hands clasped together, beaming. Good. You'll see. This will be your sanctuary. I'll make sure of it. Gretel forced herself to sit down, her eyes darting around the room. It was warm, safe, but it felt like a trap. The walls felt too close, the woman's smile too wide. As the fire crackled in the corner and the darkness deepened outside, Gretel couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far worse than the wasteland. Chapter 4. Behind the Facade. The days inside the compound blurred together in a haze of warmth and routine. The woman, who called herself Marta, was always nearby, watching with a careful, motherly eye. At first, the change was a relief. Hansel and Gretel had been on the edge of collapse when they arrived, and now they had food, shelter, and rest. The constant ache of hunger had faded, replaced by the smell of rich broth, steaming vegetables, and bread fresh from the oven. Hansel ate with gusto, his strength slowly returning, or so Gretel thought at first. But something gnawed at her, even as Marta smiled and reassured them that everything would be fine. The compound, with its soft blankets and flickering lights, no longer felt like a sanctuary. Instead, it was beginning to feel like a cage. It wasn't just the heavy doors that locked with a mechanical click each night. It was the way Marta seemed to hover over them, always with that same gentle, knowing smile. She watched them eat, encouraged Hansel to take more and more food, urging him to fatten up as if he were nothing more than livestock. You've been too thin for too long, Hansel, Marta would say, her voice dripping with concern. You need to build up your strength. We can't have you wasting away. Hansel, too exhausted to notice anything amiss, gladly accepted the extra portions. He would eat until his stomach bulged, his face flushed from the heat of the food, and then collapse into sleep, sated but sluggish. Gretel, on the other hand, grew more cautious with each passing day. The food that had once seemed like a blessing now tasted like ash in her mouth. Marta had forbidden them from leaving the compound. The world outside is too dangerous, she'd said, her tone absolute. You wouldn't last a day without me. No one does. This is your home now. For Hansel, the words were a comfort, a promise of safety. For Gretel, they were chains. The compound itself was unnervingly clean, each room meticulously organized, as if no one had lived in them for years. There were places, though, that Marta kept locked. Rooms at the far end of the compound, their heavy steel doors closed tight. Gretel's curiosity burned, but Marta would always wave her away with a smile. Those are places you don't need to see, she'd say softly. Nothing in there for you, just old supplies and things from before the collapse. At night, when Hansel was sleeping deeply after another heavy meal, Gretel would creep through the compound's halls. She'd listen at the doors, trying to catch a sound, anything to explain the strange tension that tightened in her chest. She'd tried asking Marta about the locks, but each time she asked, Marta's expression darkened, her smile fading. "You don't trust me, do you?" she'd whispered one evening, her voice thick with disappointment. "After all I've done for you, you still doubt me?" The guilt had twisted in Gretel's gut, making her feel small and ungrateful. But something deeper, more primal, refused to let her rest. There was something wrong here. Something Marta was hiding behind her kindly words and warm meals. Hansel, too wrapped in his gratitude, didn't see it. He spent his days resting, eating, and drifting in and out of a sluggish stupor. His body had begun to change, heavier, slower. He wasn't the brother she had run through the wasteland with, sharp and alert. His eyes seemed clouded now, his steps lethargic. "She's just helping us, Gretel," he'd muttered one evening when she voiced her concern. "You're being paranoid." But Gretel couldn't shake the feeling that Marta's help with a price they hadn't yet seen. The way she always urged Hansel to eat more, while Gretel's own portions remained small, deliberate. The way Marta would keep Hansel close, touching his arm, his shoulder, as if she were nurturing something, but not out of kindness. Then there was the isolation, the way Marta made Gretel feel like she didn't belong in their little trio. Every time Gretel tried to speak to Hansel privately, Marta would appear, a silent observer with that ever-present smile. "It's just that I worry about you, dear," Marta would say. "You're so tense. Hansel needs to rest, and you need to learn to relax. You're safe here. Why can't you just let yourself be at ease?" But Gretel couldn't relax. Not when the locked doors called to her in the dark. One night, after Marta had given Hansel another oversized helping of stew and tucked him in like a child, Gretel made her move. She waited until the compound was silent, the only sound, the faint hum of the generator somewhere deep below. Hansel was snoring softly, his body limp and heavy with sleep. Marta had long since retired to her room, confident in her control over them both. Gretel slipped from her cot, her feet bare on the cold floor as she crept toward the locked rooms. The hallway was dimly lit, the shadows long and distorted. The closer she got to the far end of the compound, the more her pulse quickened. The first door she tried was locked, just as she'd expected. But the second door, the one with the faint scratches around the handle, clicked open under the lightest touch. The air inside was stale, and the faint scent of rot lingered in the dark corners. She hesitated only for a moment before slipping inside, her heart pounding in her throat. The room was small, crammed with strange equipment Gretel didn't recognize. Wires and machines were piled in neat stacks, some of them half-functional, others completely broken. But it wasn't the tech that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the clothes. Children's clothes, scattered across the floor, tucked into the corners like forgotten relics, stained, torn, some of them barely larger than her hand. They were old, years perhaps, but unmistakable. And there were more. Piles of boots, shoes, small bags filled with trinkets that other children just like them had once carried. There were tech implants, too, strange, gleaming parts that had been surgically removed from bodies, lined up like trophies. Gretel's stomach turned. Others had been here before them, and they hadn't survived. The realization hit her like a wave of cold water. Marta's kindness, her care, it had all been a mask, a trap. She turned, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She needed to get Hansel, to wake him, to escape before it was too late. But as she reached for the door, she heard it. The soft sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, and there stood Marta, her face illuminated by the dim light from the hallway. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of quiet, knowing satisfaction. "You shouldn't have gone in there, Gretel," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You've seen too much now." Gretel backed away, her heart racing, her mind spinning with terror. But Marta only stepped forward, closing the door behind her with a final resounding click. "You're not leaving," Marta whispered. "Not until I decide." Chapter 5: The Cage. The air in the hidden corridors of the compound was colder, sharper, like a tomb sealed away from the world. Gretel's wrists throbbed where Marta had bound them. Her skin rubbed raw from the coarse rope as she was dragged deeper into the compound's underbelly. The cheerful glow of the upper rooms felt a world away now, replaced by the suffocating darkness of narrow, concrete hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. Marta had said nothing as she led Gretel through the labyrinth of locked doors and forgotten rooms. But her silence was no longer warm or inviting. Now it was predatory. The floor beneath Gretel's feet was slick with something she didn't want to think about, the metallic scent of blood unmistakable in the thick air. With each step, the tension in her chest tightened like a vice. She didn't know what lay ahead, but whatever it was, it would be worse than anything she'd imagined. They reached the end of the hall, where Marta paused before a door reinforced with thick steel bars. She glanced over her shoulder, her once kind face now a mask of cold calculation. "This is what happens when you don't trust me," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "When you don't understand what I do for you." The door groaned open, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The smell hit Gretel first, a pungent stench of rot and chemicals. Her stomach twisted violently as her eyes adjusted to the scene before her. The room was a twisted mockery of the orderly compound above. Large metal tables lined the walls, covered in blood-stained tools, medical instruments that had long since lost their gleam. Strange machinery hummed in the corners, tubes and wires snaking across the floor like living things. Cages, small, rusted cages, were stacked against the far wall, and inside them were skeletal remains, shrunken and decayed. But it was the center of the room that made Gretel's breath catch in her throat. Hansel. He was slumped inside a cage too small for his growing body, his limbs bent awkwardly, his skin pale and slick with sweat. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. A thick band of straps held him against the metal bars, his wrists and ankles bound tight. Beside the cage stood a metal table with an array of scalpels, needles, and surgical saws laid out with precision. "Hansel!" Gretel screamed, thrashing against her restraints. But he didn't move. He was barely conscious, his head lolling to the side, as if whatever drug Marta had been feeding him had finally taken full control. Marta shut the door behind them, the echo of the lock sealing off any hope of escape. She moved slowly toward Hansel, her gaze lingering on his body with a strange, almost reverent hunger. "He was perfect," she murmured, more to herself than to Gretel. "So strong, so full of life. The others, they never lasted this long. But Hansel, he was different. He'll keep me alive for years." Gretel's heart pounded in her chest, the reality of the situation crashing down like a weight too heavy to bear. Marta wasn't just fattening them up for survival. She wasn't keeping them safe. She was harvesting them, taking what she needed to extend her own miserable life in this wasteland. "You're a monster," Gretel spat, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "He trusted you." Marta turned to her, that unsettling smile creeping back onto her face. "Trust. It's such a fragile thing, isn't it? People want to believe in safety and kindness, but in the end, survival is all that matters." She reached out, her fingers brushing over the instruments on the table, delicate and practiced. "It's not personal, Gretel. It's just the way things are now. People die, but I don't have to." Marta's eyes gleamed as she selected a large syringe, its needle gleaming under the dim light. "Your brother has been drugged, yes, but it's his blood I need first. His organs later, when the time is right. The others before you were too weak, but you two, you were special." Gretel's mind raced, panic clawing at her. Hansel's pale face filled her vision, his body trapped in that cage like an animal, barely holding on. She had to do something. She had to stop this. "You're insane," Gretel hissed, taking a step back, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anything she could use. Her hands were still bound, but she could feel the knots loosening as she flexed her fingers. Marta moved toward Hansel's cage, the syringe in hand, ready to begin her gruesome work. "You'll see," she whispered. "You'll understand soon enough. It's all about survival." But Gretel wasn't going to let her touch him. Not again. She spotted it. A small, jagged piece of metal on the floor, half hidden under one of the tables. It must have been discarded during one of Marta's earlier procedures, stained with dried blood but still sharp enough. Gretel lunged, dropping to her knees, ignoring the pain as she scraped her bound wrists against the jagged edge. The rope frayed under the pressure, snapping just as Marta turned her attention back to her. Gretel scrambled to her feet, grabbing the metal shard and holding it out in front of her like a weapon. "You're not touching him," Gretel growled, her voice low and dangerous. "I'll kill you if I have to." Marta raised an eyebrow, amused. "Do you really think you can stop me, child?" But Gretel didn't answer. Her focus was on Hansel, on the way his breathing had slowed even further. She had to act now, or he wouldn't make it. In a blur of movement, Gretel darted toward Marta, the metal shard flashing in her hand. Marta was fast, faster than Gretel expected, but not fast enough. The shard tore through the air, slashing across Marta's arm, drawing blood. Marta gasped, more in surprise than pain. Her eyes darkened, her smile vanishing. "You shouldn't have done that." Gretel backed away, her heart racing. She'd landed a blow, but it wasn't enough. Marta was still standing, and now she was angry. Before Gretel could react, Marta lunged at her, grabbing her wrist with terrifying strength. The syringe clattered to the floor as they struggled, Marta's grip tightening, her nails digging into Gretel's skin. They crashed against one of the tables, scattering instruments everywhere. Desperation surged through Gretel as she fought, her hands scrabbling for anything she could use. Her fingers closed around a small, jagged piece of tech, one of the implants Marta had removed from her previous victims. Without thinking, Gretel drove the tech into Marta's side, twisting it with all the strength she could muster. Marta screamed, a horrible guttural sound that echoed through the cold, dark room. She staggered back, clutching at the wound, her face twisted in agony. Gretel didn't wait. She rushed to Hansel's cage, frantically tugging at the straps that held him. Her hands shook, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but finally the bindings gave way. "Hansel, wake up," she pleaded, her voice trembling as she shook him. "We have to go. Please, wake up." But Hansel's eyes remained closed, his body limp. Behind her, Marta's ragged breathing filled the room. "You can't escape," she gasped, her voice thick with pain. "You're both mine." Gretel's eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding. She needed more time, she needed to get Hansel out, but there was nowhere left to run, and Marta was still coming. Chapter 6. The Escape. The darkness in the bowels of the compound seemed to thicken with every passing second, the air heavy with the stench of death and rot. Gretel knelt beside Hansel's cage, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Her brother's skin was cold, his face pale, but his chest still rose and fell in faint, uneven breaths. He was alive, barely. Behind her, Marta's agonized groans echoed through the room, the sound scraping against Gretel's nerves. She could hear the woman struggling to rise, the sickening sound of metal and flesh tearing as she tried to pull the shard of tech from her side. Gretel's mind raced, panic surging through her veins. There was no time. "Wake up, Hansel," Gretel whispered fiercely, shaking him again. "I need you. Please." But Hansel didn't stir. Marta's voice cut through the darkness, a low, rasping growl. "You think you can fight me, little girl?" Her words dripped with venom, each one more menacing than the last. "You don't know what I've done to survive. You're nothing compared to me." Gretel's hands fumbled as she worked to undo the last of Hansel's restraints. Her heart hammered in her chest, her fingers trembling with urgency. She could hear Marta staggering toward them, the sound of her footsteps uneven but determined. With one final tug, the straps gave way and Hansel slumped forward into Gretel's arms. He was heavy, his body limp and unresponsive, but she pulled him free from the cage, refusing to let the weight of him slow her down. Marta's shadow fell over them. Gretel whipped around, clutching the jagged piece of tech she had used earlier, brandishing it like a weapon. Marta's face was twisted in fury and pain, blood seeping through her fingers where she clutched the wound in her side. Her eyes, once filled with false kindness, now burned with malice. "I should have killed you first." Marta spat, her voice a hiss. "You could have made this so much easier." Gretel rose to her feet, standing between Marta and Hansel, her hands shaking but steadying as she gripped the makeshift weapon. "You won't touch him again." Marta's smile was grotesque, a twisted parody of the warmth she had once shown them. "I've lived through worse than you, child. Do you think you're the first to try and fight back?" But Gretel didn't flinch. This woman, this monster, had stolen everything from them. She had lured them into this nightmare, fed them lies, and used them like cattle. Fear melted away, replaced by something colder, sharper: determination. As Marta lunged, Gretel reacted on instinct, ducking low and driving the shard of metal deep into Marta's leg. The woman let out a shriek, collapsing to one knee as the pain overwhelmed her. She grabbed wildly at Gretel, but her movements were slower now, her strength faltering as blood poured from her wounds. "You think you've won?" Marta gasped, her voice ragged. "There's nowhere to go. You're trapped in here, just like the others." Gretel didn't respond. Her eyes flicked to the far wall, where the cabinets were lined with old machinery, wires, gas canisters, and broken tech from another time. A plan began to form in her mind. She couldn't just fight Marta. She had to destroy everything. Without hesitation, Gretel rushed toward the equipment. Her hands moved with grim purpose, grabbing one of the old gas canisters, wrenching off its cap, and turning it toward the center of the room. The hiss of escaping gas filled the air, pungent and thick. Marta's eyes widened in realization. No, you can't." But Gretel was already moving. She grabbed another canister, then another, creating a flood of gas in the room as Marta struggled to her feet, clutching at the wound in her leg. Gretel's hands trembled, but she kept going, her mind focused on one thing: escape. "You think burning this place will save you?" Marta's voice cracked, her fury giving way to desperation. "You'll die out there. You'll starve, just like the rest." Gretel ignored her, her eyes fixed on Hansel. He still hadn't woken, but she could see the slight rise and fall of his chest. She had to get him out. Now. With the last canister drained, Gretel backed away toward the door, dragging Hansel with her, her muscles screaming in protest. Marta staggered toward them, her eyes wild with rage, but she was slower now, weakened. "You can't." Marta reached for Gretel, but Gretel was ready. In a single motion, Gretel grabbed a discarded piece of metal from the floor and struck it against the concrete wall, sparks flying. The gas caught in an instant, flames roaring to life as the room erupted in a blinding flash of heat and fire. Marta screamed, a terrible, guttural wail that echoed through the compound as the flames consumed her. Her control, her mask of kindness, shattered as she flailed in desperation, her body engulfed in the fire. Gretel didn't stop to watch. She dragged Hansel through the door and into the narrow hallway, the heat from the fire chasing after them. The compound's dark corridors stretched out before them, a maze of shadows and flickering light. But Gretel kept moving, her mind racing. They had to get out before the flames spread. Behind them, Marta's screams grew more frantic, her voice rising in a desperate plea. "You can't leave me. You won't survive without me." But Gretel didn't look back. She forced her legs to keep moving, pulling Hansel through the narrow passageways, her breath coming in ragged gasps as smoke began to fill the air. The fire was spreading faster than she'd anticipated, the gas fueling it into an inferno. The compound groaned around them, the walls trembling as the heat intensified. Flames licked at the edges of the ceiling, curling around the metal beams like claws. The smell of burning flesh and melting metal filled the air, choking Gretel's lungs. They reached the main door, the heavy steel barrier that had once seemed so impenetrable. Gretel slammed her shoulder into it, her muscles burning with the effort. For a terrifying moment, it didn't budge, the weight of it holding fast. But then with a grinding creak, the door gave way, swinging open to the night beyond. Cold air rushed in, a stark contrast to the heat and smoke behind them. Gretel dragged Hansel over the threshold, collapsing onto the cracked earth outside. She gasped for breath, her lungs burning, her hands trembling from the exertion. The compound roared behind them, a pillar of fire and smoke rising into the sky. Inside, Marta's screams had turned to gurgling cries, barely audible over the roar of the flames. Gretel pushed herself up, her eyes fixed on the burning structure. She didn't feel relief, only exhaustion, an emptiness that gnawed at her. The nightmare wasn't over. But at least they were free. Hansel stirred beside her, his eyelids fluttering open, his voice hoarse and weak. "Gretel? We're out," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We're safe." But as the flames consumed the compound, casting flickering shadows over the wasteland, Gretel knew the truth. They weren't safe. Not yet. The wasteland stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. But as they staggered to their feet, leaving the burning remnants of Marta's hell behind, Gretel tightened her grip on Hansel's hand. They were survivors, and whatever came next, they would face it together. Chapter 7. Ashes and Hunger. The wasteland stretched out in every direction, a barren sea of cracked earth and jagged rocks under the endless gray sky. The air was still, the quiet oppressive, as if the world itself had given up on the promise of life. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on Hansel and Gretel as they moved forward, weak but alive. Behind them, a thin plume of smoke curled into the sky, the last remnants of the compound, now nothing more than ashes. Gretel didn't look back. She couldn't. The horrors of that place, of Marta's twisted cruelty, were etched into her mind, and no matter how far they walked, she knew the memories would never truly leave her, but they had survived. And in this world, that was all that mattered. Hansel limped beside her, his face pale, his eyes sunken with fatigue. The drug Marta had used to keep him docile had taken its toll, leaving him weak and disoriented. But his steps, though slow, were steady. He was recovering inch by inch, and the fire in his eyes, though dimmer, was still there. "You sure you're okay?" Gretel asked, her voice hoarse from the smoke and ash still clinging to her throat. Hansel nodded, though the movement seemed to take effort. "I'll be fine," he murmured, his voice rough. "We made it out. That's what matters." Gretel didn't respond. She wanted to believe it, to find comfort in the fact that they had escaped with their lives. But the world outside the compound was just as merciless. The wasteland didn't care about survival. It took and took until there was nothing left to give. The ground crunched beneath their boots as they walked, the silence between them heavy with unspoken thoughts. The sun hung low in the sky, its light muted by the ever-present haze, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape. In the distance, the remains of a once thriving city loomed like a skeleton, its skyscrapers toppled and broken, covered in dust, a haunting reminder of what the world had been. Gretel's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her jaw clenched. She had always been the cautious one, the one who saw the danger before it struck. But even now, after everything they had been through, the weight of the world pressed down on her like never before. Trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Marta's betrayal had carved that truth into her soul. Do you think we'll ever find somewhere safe?" Hansel asked, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost fragile, as if the question itself was a wound that might never heal. Gretel hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of the tattered pack slung over her shoulder. She wanted to protect him from the truth, to shelter him from the harshness of reality, but there was no point in lying anymore. Not to Hansel, not after all they'd seen. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "Maybe, but we can't trust anyone. Not anymore." Hansel glanced at her, his brow furrowing. He was older now, in ways that had nothing to do with years. The innocence that had once clung to him was gone, stripped away by the horror of what they had endured. But even now, after the cages and the blood and the fire, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a hope that Gretel couldn't understand. "We have to try," Hansel said, his voice stronger now, though it still trembled at the edges. "Not everyone's like her. Not everyone's a monster." Gretel's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to believe him, but the memories of Marta's smile, the kindness in her voice, the way she had promised safety and warmth, still lingered in her mind. Trust was a weapon, a blade people used to cut you down when you were most vulnerable. She wouldn't let that happen again. They continued in silence for a while longer, their footsteps the only sound in the vast emptiness. The sun began to sink lower, casting an orange glow over the wasteland, painting the rocks and dust in strange, shifting hues. Gretel's body ached with exhaustion, her muscles screaming for rest, but she kept walking. Stopping wasn't an option. Stopping meant death. As they crested a small rise, something caught Hansel's eye. He stopped, squinting into the distance, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Gretel, look." Gretel turned, following his gaze. Far off, barely visible on the horizon, were the faint outlines of buildings, small, clustered together, like a settlement. Lights flickered faintly between them, too far to make out clearly but unmistakable. The sight sent a jolt through her, a strange mix of hope and dread coiling in her stomach. A settlement. Gretel's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. It could be a trap. Another place like Marta's compound, filled with promises of safety that would unravel the moment they stepped inside. The thought of facing more deceit, more danger, made her stomach churn. But Hansel was already moving, his pace quickening, his eyes fixed on the distant lights. "Gretel, we have to check it out. There might be food, shelter. We can't keep going like this." Gretel didn't move. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to stay away from those flickering lights and the people who might be waiting for them. The wasteland was cruel, but at least it was predictable. People were the real danger. Hansel stopped, turning to face her. His eyes, though still weary, held that same spark of hope. "We can't just keep running. We need to try again. Maybe this place, maybe it'll be different." Gretel's mouth felt dry. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that nothing was different, that the world would only keep taking from them until there was nothing left. But she couldn't bring herself to crush the last bit of hope he clung to. She stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the horizon, the distant settlement looming like a question she didn't want to answer. Hansel's optimism felt foreign to her now, a relic of a world that had died long ago. But she couldn't ignore the reality of their situation. They were weak. They needed food, shelter, and maybe, just maybe, a chance. Hansel waited for her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of agreement. Gretel didn't respond, but slowly she began to walk toward the settlement, her steps slow and deliberate. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust anything. But they would go. Because survival didn't wait for fear or doubt. It didn't wait for trust to rebuild. It demanded action, even when every instinct told you to run the other way. As the sun sank lower, casting the wasteland in long shadows, Gretel's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her thoughts dark and heavy. The world had taken everything from them: home, safety, innocence, but it hadn't taken their will to survive. Not yet. Whatever waited for them in that settlement, she would be ready. They were no longer the children who had stumbled through the wasteland, clinging to hope. They were something else now. Survivors. And nothing would take that from them. Not again. As the first flicker of lights came into clearer view, Gretel's jaw tightened, her mind sharpening like the knife at her side. No more trust. No more illusions. Only survival. The end. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this retelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss new stories. We bring classic plays, fairy tales, and timeless stories to life with a fresh twist. And if you know someone who'd enjoy these reimagined tales, please share the channel with them. Your support helps us continue to grow and bring more stories to you.